USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Spotlight, a weekly podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com, featuring conversations with college hockey coaches and players and journalists who cover the sport.
Welcome to USCHO Spotlight, the Friday at the Frozen Four edition for April 9th, 2021. I'm Ed Trefzger, and in addition to my usual podcast partner, Jim Connelly, we're joined by two other esteemed journalists in the field of college hockey. One of our USCHO staffers, our editor emeritus, and also writer for the Wisconsin State Journal and Madison.com, Todd Milewski.
Hi, guys.
Hi, Todd. And also Chris Peters, who's well known and is a new venture, Hockey Sense with Chris Peters, as well as the Talking Hockey Sense podcast. So, Chris, thank you for joining us again.
Thanks for having me, guys. Good to be with you.
Well, it was quite an evening last night, Jim.
Yeah, it was. And, we're usually doing this in a bar and we're doing it in a hotel room. This is what COVID does to us, but it's great to be enjoyed by really a good panel of guests here. And what a night. I mean, I was just talking with Bruce Siski on his radio show back in Duluth, and I haven't done it yet, but I need to go back and find a record book and kind of go back each year and remember if there was really ever a Thursday with two absolutely thrilling games. When the last time was, I mean, this is my 25th Frozen Four. I don't remember that type of anticipation and excitement through both semifinals. Usually you get one that's a dud and one that's exciting. And I thought after we had that 5-4 thriller with a last minute goal with St. Cloud State and Minnesota State, that maybe the UMass and Minnesota Duluth game was going to be a bit of a dud, and it at times felt slow, but what a thriller that turned out to be. It really was good hockey.
Yeah, the first two periods, I was feeling like UMass was going to fade and that they were going to get dominated by Minnesota Duluth, but they found something in that third period, and particularly in overtime.
Yeah, they really did. And, I mean, it was that overtime period from UMass was one of the more insane turnarounds in a game, because really when Minnesota Duluth has a lead at any point, you don't expect teams to come back. And then they get a goal, a hard-working goal, the kind of goal you have to score against Duluth. And then all of a sudden they dominated the overtime period. Great pace. This looked like the UMass team that, was in mid-season form. Like they had no losses, like they had no issues, like the depth really shone brightly. And it was something that Greg Carville mentioned as well, was getting the fourth line engaged over the course of the game allowed them to be fresher in overtime and really dominate.
That Duluth team that we saw 2 years ago was what I had in my head when I saw UMass last night. That, even when things weren't looking great, you knew that there was something there that they could turn to. And I mean, there was a long stretch of the game where UMass didn't get through the neutral zone, didn't even really seem to have a plan to get through the neutral zone, or just dumping it in. But having the pieces in place, the veterans, the guys that have been there before, we knew Duluth had that, maybe a little less than they had in previous years. But I think UMass really built on what they had a couple of years ago and through last year, and then put it back together here this year.
And Greg Carville, after the game last night, really wanted to talk about his team's depth. And he, comparatively was saying that, he felt like Duluth was cutting back to just rolling three lines where he was going forward. And I think he had the quote that every time I looked down the bench and called the next line, I never saw them look fatigued. Like he knew that his guys were fresh even into the overtime. And, he also kind of talked about dominating the third period in the overtime. I didn't feel that UMass dominated the third period. They got their goal on their best scoring chance. Undoubtedly, they got in, a couple of shots that were thrown toward the net. You've got some really talented players there in Lapina and Trevino that are getting these pucks on the net. But then Anthony Delgaiso, the guy who had to jump up onto the first line. It was a mixed line when they were out there, but he jumped up and was, taking the place of Carson Gaskevich, who was out for COVID protocols. And here we are, a next man up mentality, and they got that. But once they got to the overtime, and I don't know, what the switch was that was flipped. And there was a switch flipped. And I know that you wanted to say it's good conditioning, it's all that. No, something happened on that bench that UMass came out for overtime and was ready to dominate. They forced turnovers. They put pressure on. Their forecheck changed. It was much harder in the overtime. And because of that, they really did dominate.
Yeah, it was incredible, the change. 13-2 shots on goal in those 14 and a half minutes of overtime. 30-6 in shot attempts, which is remarkable. Meanwhile, in the first two periods, Matt Murray, who hadn't played since January 18th, really kept UMass in the game. He had to come up with some really huge stops. He said he felt comfortable, but I thought it was fascinating that his coach, Greg Carville, despite on Wednesday talking about how confident he was in his team, really said he was concerned about what might happen in the goaltending.
And you saw it early too. He was solid. He was great all night. He made some big saves in that game. But there was times that I thought that when there would be small redirects, his balance looked off. And that's reactions. That's somebody that hasn't played in basically almost 3 months on the calendar. And he said that he approached every practice as a game. And then Greg Carville came out, 10 minutes later in his press conference and said, listen, you can't replicate games. And he's right. You can't. And
right.
And I liked the way that he improved as that game went on. And by the time you got to the third period, you didn't have to worry about him. You knew that he was engaged, ready to make the big saves when the opportunities came.
And that came right away in the third period, too, because Nick Swaney broke in.
9 seconds in.
Made a great play, and I thought that was really the moment where that game flipped for me. And I agree. I don't think that UMass dominated that period, but making that save, imagine it gets to 3-1 at that point. There's no way Duluth has given up 2 goals in that game.
Right.
And so that was the key moment. And of course, it's the guy that, as you mentioned, hadn't played in a long time. That was the big question. We knew that he could play. We've seen him do it. But when you've been off for that long, you need to have those big moments. And then here he is, and he only had to face 2 shots in overtime. But I mean, still, that third period save is the one that stands out for me.
2 sides of the coin here for me. For what Jimmy, what you were talking about a couple minutes ago about UMass's depth and physical, strength, or the stamina that they had to play as well as they did late in the game. Duluth, I thought, really went the other direction. Well, I don't know what it was, whether it was nerves, whether it was just some tentative shifts. They had so much trouble getting the puck out of their own zone, making some sloppy plays that we don't normally see from them, being slow to pucks on the wall, not taking good angles to pucks in the corners. It just looked like everything was starting to turn bad for them at one point in the third period, and that's what did carry through into overtime then, too.
I think that it was interesting. You covered the story on whether Minnesota Duluth had fatigue from not rolling 4 lines, which is what Greg Carville said. Scott Sandelin said, well, we were playing so much defense, but that's sort of a chicken and egg thing there, one contributing to the other.
Yeah.
But not everybody, I think it's becoming more common in college hockey to roll 4 lines, but not everybody does it. And in a game like that, to be able to just keep rolling, I think is going to be helpful. And we'll get into what happens on Saturday night, but then you're going to have 2 teams that are going to depend on depth like that. But, is there something to be said for what Greg Carville said that Duluth was getting worn out in that?
I didn't actually see the game. I'm going to reference something that I've read that was said back in the regional, where Colby Cohen for ESPN said that he thought that this was a better team for UMass than when they had
Cale McCarr
and Mario Ferraro.
Right.
And Barry Melrose, from what I hear, ripped him apart for saying that. How can you say that, this team doesn't have Cale McCarr? They're not the same team. This team is better. They have more depth.
Yes.
Yeah, you're talking. You had 2 elite defensemen. Now they have 4 high-end defensemen. I bet at least 3 of those defensemen that we saw in that game last night play in the NHL within the next 3 years. And Chris, you'll back me up on this stuff. And then you look at some of their top line, their top 2 lines. I'd put them out there against anybody in the country. And then they've got some grinders that wear you down. They don't have to score goals, but if they can wear you down, I think that was what UMass successfully did at times last night. That can be a real tough hurdle to overcome.
I hadn't seen a lot of Zach Jones before last night's game. But, man, he was everywhere. I mean, D zone, offensive zone, in the corners, leading rushes. I mean, Chris, you've seen him probably more than anybody, maybe Jimmy has. But, I mean, is that a surprise to you that he did as much as he did on the stage that he did last night?
Not at all. I mean, this is what he's done. He was at the World Juniors 2 years ago, and I think that was kind of his coming out party as a top prospect. I saw him in the USHL when he was with Tri-City. I mean, this is a guy that has done this at every level so far. And he played some of his best hockey in overtime. I think between him, Matt Kessel, I mean, that's such a tremendous defensive pairing. And then, the guy who I think will be the unsung hero of this game is actually Mark Delgaizo, who played big time minutes in key situations. And he played, it felt like he played about half the overtime. They were using him a lot. And so that whole decor really did show up. Now, I stopped short of saying that they're a better team for sure. They're not as talented, and that's a difference. And that the thing is this tournament shows you don't need the best team to win it. You need, a group that is going at the same rate in the same way. And I think UMass has been doing that for weeks now.
You talk about a better team. It's probably also, with 2 more years of experience, a better coaching staff and maybe better preparing the team for this stage.
100%. I think that they learned so much from that last process, and I think that they were overwhelmed by the whole environment of the situation. And Greg Carville mentioned this, how tired they were by the time they got to the championship game. They had Cale Makar's Hobie Baker ceremony the night before. They had, an overtime game in the semifinal, and it overwhelmed them. By the time they got there, they weren't ready for what Minnesota Duluth was throwing at them. This time, and I think we've seen this over the last few weeks, going back to the Hockey East tournament as well, this is a team that knew that they had to build to this moment. They had to, because I think that they've continually played better as time has gone on here. And so and it's the same thing like when we talk about World Juniors or any kind of tournament where there's single elimination. It's all about getting better and being the best at the right time. And I think that's what UMass is right now.
Another thing that goes back to your point about learning is keeping the personnel intact too. You've got some pretty high-end coaches there. Ben Barr is mentioned every time there seems to be a job opening.
Yeah.
And you've got Jared DeMichael, who's proving himself to be not just an excellent goaltending coach, but really elite recruiter of student athletes. They've stayed intact 2 years later. And I think that that's something that they were able to bring back was not just one coach having some memories and then having to have 2 assistants with them that are different and weren't there, 2 years ago, and you're trying to tell them what it's going to be like. And, but I mean, these coaches have been there, they've learned, and they've certainly taken advantage of what they've learned.
Well, let's take a quick pause and then we'll talk about the early game that had St. Cloud State and Minnesota State. This is USCHO Spotlight from USCHO.com.
This is the USCHO Spotlight, a weekly podcast from US College Hockey Online.
Continuing now with USCHO Spotlight, I'm Ed Trefzger with Jim Connelly, Todd Milewski, Chris Peters. The early game was fascinating as well. And it's one where both teams had to mount comebacks.
Where did you expect that offense was going to come from?
Right.
I looked at these two teams. I was talking with John Buccigross between periods in the hallway from the press box. He's like, I had the over on the under game. I had the under on the early game. I did not have the over on either of these games, really. And I didn't either. I understood that, I saw St. Cloud in the Albany Regional, so I knew that they had talent. I knew they had some scoring. They had lost a good player in Brodzinski. I knew they had good goaltending, though, and I knew they had good defense. And all I've ever heard about Minnesota State is how they can lock you down and limit the number of shots. And they did that at times in that game last night, and I thought that they were going to win because of that. But 5-4? Did anybody see 9 goals coming in that game?
Well, no, not like that. But I mean, we'd seen some of those characteristics pop up with Mankato, Minnesota State, in the last few weeks. I mean, that stinker that they threw out there in the WCHA semifinals against Northern at home was one of those like really eyes open, kind of like, oh, this can happen to a team like this that has kind of just rolled through the whole season, pretty much in the WCHA, and then you saw it again in the first period of that game against Quinnipiac in the first game of the regionals. They pulled it back from there, and then from there, like the game against Minnesota that was really never in doubt once they got going to their game. But you saw those openings happen, and so when it got to that point yesterday, you're starting to think, did this team lose something along the way where it lost some components of their defensive zone structure? I thought that really just popped up at really bad times,
Right.
where they were losing guys to the inside and just not having good coverage around the front of the net. And that's, it's a terrible time for it to happen, but it happens to every team. And you just hope your veterans, and they have a veteran decor, wouldn't let that happen at that time. It happened to some of the better of them in a really bad time.
And there were, like I said, there were components where their defense was really strong yesterday. I was, when they went from 3-1 down and then took a 4-3 lead, I'm starting to figure out where I'm going with my story, and I'm starting to look at stats. And if I had the stat right from the time it was 3-1, so that was really early in the second period, through that entire rest of the second and through a good part of the third, they'd only allowed 7 shots. And of that, really, maybe 1 was of the quality variety. So they had gotten into that lockdown mode, but then St. Cloud found that other gear. We talked about UMass doing it, and St. Cloud found that other gear. And that was when they were able to really put the pressure on. And then Minnesota State got back on their heels.
Yeah, and I think the thing about Minnesota State is one of the reasons that they're such a good team defensively is because of how they do play with the puck. I mean, they push the pace. If we watch the Minnesota game, that was them dictating the pace of that game. They never I don't think at any point of that game, they were truly dictating the pace of the game as much as they had in previous games. So I think, part of it was that they weren't locking things down. They weren't getting the puck back as easily. And their defense is such an important part for kind of playing that possession game where they're getting pucks up ice and they're applying the pressure. They did have those longer stretches in the middle of the game where they got to it a little bit, but it wasn't nearly to the level of Minnesota. And then that's where you have to really respect St. Cloud State for staying with it, giving up 3 straight goals and finding a way to just, and they weren't pretty goals. They weren't big, big high skill plays. They were, they have this incredible tip in the last minute of the game to end it. I think both teams showed their resilience. I think that both teams showed that they're not the playoff chokers that everybody had made them out to be coming into this tournament, because that one could have gone either way. I think, you get that game to overtime. It's anybody's game, but here it is, a high slot tip at the last minute. That's just one of those plays where, there's nothing you can do about
Tip your
it.
hat.
Yeah, exactly.
What can you do about that? Yeah.
And a bit has been made about the next man up situation with St. Cloud State. Easton Brodzinski out with a broken femur. It seems like the team really has kind of rallied around that.
You look at, you throw Kyler Kupka up onto the first line from the fourth line. He ends up with a goal and an assist. You had to fill his spot on the fourth line, and you throw in Joe Moliner, who hasn't played in a while.
Yep.
And he ends up with the tying goal.
Right.
Like, not just any goal, the tying goal when that game was really in the balance. You're down 4-3 struggling. We saw it even out in the regional when Brodzinski goes down. You could hear, I was in Albany and I had the ESPN headset on. I was working for them. And so you get the effects mics and you're hearing almost the bench through the headsets. And they were screaming. Like, after Brodzinski went down the runway, they were screaming at each other. Come on, boys. This is our moment. And all, you could hear those things. And they've shown it. Like, it's one thing to get excited and say those things. It's another thing to know that you can go out and execute.
Right.
And they continually go out and execute.
And that's good leadership, right? It comes down to that. You start with a coach, but then you got to have the right guys in the room pushing that along. Spencer Myers scores the first goal for them yesterday, gets them going a little bit. I think a little bit of his role is, not only having the voice, but putting together plays like that, too.
Yeah. And Nolan Walker, too, who gets the game-winning goal, and it had that incredible assist on their response after, the game went 1-1. He goes into the zone. He drew 3 guys to him, and all of a sudden everything opens up. And that's, again, that was one of those instances where Minnesota State's, some of their inexperience showed because there were some younger guys out there, but then all of a sudden you have Nolan Walker. The way that they stepped up and the way that both fourth lines played in this game too was a huge factor in the result as well. Because, you got some skill guys like Nathan Smith going, but St. Cloud skill guys were not much of a factor in this game. It was all about the grit, the senior leadership, the juniors, guys like that are making plays.
Well, that brings us to Saturday's national championship game, and it should be a fascinating matchup between a UMass team that is getting 3 players back, and we should talk about that. And also St. Cloud, both teams rolling 4 lines, going to be very deep. It may be those fourth liners who play a big role. But let's start with UMass. Kind of unexpectedly, 12:18 a.m., press release comes out of UMass that 3 of the 4 players that had been isolated for COVID are coming back. Maybe that brings up a question about what do you do in net. I mean, Matt Murray played well, did his job. Philip Lindbergh has been the guy down the stretch.
He has been, and obviously I think, Greg Carvel's made this big thing of, I don't want anybody telling me what's happening with these players until we get to the game. And, he almost, it felt a little
dramatic.
It felt a little insincere. I think he knew the whole way what's been going on. I'll set that aside. But I think his players, that means also have known. And I think Matt Murray understood that if he could get them to the finals, Philly would probably be back on Saturday. And listen, he's still got to arrive here. I assume they're taking a private plane in. Got to test again today. Got to test again tomorrow.
Right.
So these players are not out of the woods. But you could hear Matt Murray in his post game understanding and almost resigned to the fact that, listen, this is Philly's net. I just kind of filled it for a night. I'm ready to see the band back together. I think that was the words he used. Just get the band back together, let them go. And I think that just shows a little bit of the character that they have in that locker room.
That's a very important point for any team with goaltenders who are competing to play. They very much want to be the guy in net, but they also want their team to win. And, that band back together comment, you see teams that are successful really have a good camaraderie among the goaltenders. That spreads out throughout the team, and that's part of the character that Greg Carvel was talking about. But not only do they get their star goaltender back, but they get the guy who has 17 goals this season for them.
Yeah, in a game where a guy that his size, his net front presence,
right.
the physicality that he brings is going to mean a lot, because we've seen, St. Cloud State can grind it out with the best of them. And if you have a guy like Gisevich, who has scored a lot of his goals from right in front, right around the net, similar to how Anthony Del Gaizo did in his best Carson Gisevich impression that you could ask for in that moment. That is the guy that I think even, we know what Lindbergh is capable of, but I really do think that Gisevich could be the difference maker, because we saw the depth that they had without him. Now you throw him into the mix. I mean, that's a tough order for St. Cloud to have to contend with at their net front.
Yeah, I think that gets underscored with how heavy this game is going to be.
Yes.
You have 2 teams that play very heavy hockey. And when I say heavy, and people sometimes misconstrue that expression, I'm not talking about everybody's, lining up a monster hit and we're going to have just a highlight reel after 2 periods of bodies being thrown and it's all ice. I'm just talking about forcing players, and you lean on them and you make it miserable to get to the areas. You're not throwing your weight around, but you're pushing, you're just being a little bit more difficult to deal with physically. And that, I think, is what both of these teams bring. And then you throw in the fact that you can do that up and down the lineup. 12 forwards, 6 defensemen, extra skate. It doesn't matter who it is. Every player on both of these teams seems to be able to play with that heaviness.
The thing that I always look for in a championship game, one-shot deal, goaltending. I mean, we talked about Lindbergh. On the other side, David Rennick. A guy that's been hit and miss maybe a lot of the season. Mm-hmm. It was pretty good at times yesterday, was pretty good in the regional, but pretty good doesn't win you a championship a lot of the times. You got to get to that next gear, and I think that's something that they need out of him tomorrow, because it's going to be those kind of games where you're going to have to fight through screens. You're going to get a lot of that traffic, guys going to the net. He's going to have to look through a lot of those with big UMass bodies out in front.
Yeah, and that's where your defensemen have to come in, and they're going to have to be clearing those lanes and letting the goalie see the puck. If he's not seeing the puck, and at times yesterday I did not think that either goalie in that first game was seeing the puck well because of what was going on in front. I think that UMass can capitalize on that when you have guys like Kessel and Jones back on the point and Del Gaizo, guys that can get pucks through those lanes, place them kind of where they want to in the net, not with any big slap shot or force, but they just can feather pucks perfectly to the right area or net. You don't see that. It's behind you. And those are the I look for the defense of UMass tomorrow night to be more offensively involved than they were last night, and that could be a difference maker.
Yeah, it certainly could. And I mean, I think that, when you talk about the goaltending matchup too, I think no matter who plays for UMass, and we obviously expect it to be Philly, but no matter who plays, I think they have the advantage in net. And Rennick, but the thing about Rennick that I want to say is that when he is on, he is as good as any goalie in the country. It's just, he hasn't been there as consistently enough. And so wasn't a great game in that last one, but I mean, you look at the other games that he played in the regionals, he did pretty darn well. So, he has that in him. It's going to take a special effort from him though, I think, because, if we're matching these teams up on paper, I think you have to say UMass is the favorite, but at the same time, we've seen St. Cloud really shut teams down in front of Rennick. So, very interesting matchup and kind of I think there's going to be a bit of a chess match in this one, a little bit more than we saw in the previous two games.
And the other thing, and I know Greg Carver loved and was so proud of his depth on Thursday, I think the fourth line on St. Cloud is a very talented line. Now you're going to put Kupka back there, or maybe you don't. So maybe you're still with Molinar, but you've got some ability to move guys around. And then you have Will Hammer in the middle. And that guy, he's having a great NCAA tournament. He's one of the best face-off guys I have seen. Brett Larson talked to us back in the regional about how he had guys just out there taking face-offs after practice for extra minutes every day before the regional because he wanted the centers to be dominant in the circle. And Hammer was the one guy that I think the first game, I think he was 19 for 22 on faceoffs.
Wow.
And I looked at it last night. He was 62%. It was 10 for 16. I mean, that's pretty dominant in the dot, and that puck control, I think, goes a long way, especially when you're the fourth line. And if you're fourth line against fourth line, maybe that's where you can make a difference.
Yeah, I think this is a game that you win in the margins, right? I mean, this is these teams are so tight, and faceoffs could be one of those things where, over the course of the game, they might not seem like they matter a whole lot, but then there's that one that does. That's a clean draw, and then all of a sudden you're having an opportunity. So, yeah, I mean that's going to be one of the many kind of little micro things of this game that when it comes to the net front play, the face offs. I mean, it's going to be one in the margin. Special teams, because I don't know if anybody's getting a power play the way things have been going in this tournament.
But if they are, they're going to score.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So special teams could loom large as well.
Well, why don't we summarize by talking about what each of these two teams needs to do to win on Saturday evening? Let's start, since we've just been talking about St. Cloud, let's start with the Huskies. What do the Huskies need to do to be successful?
Oh, I'd say, first of all, they need an above-average goaltending performance from Rennick. I mean, that's in this time of year, it's the simplest thing to say is that you need goaltending. But on top of that, I think that they have to be the heavier team. They're going to have to find ways to slow down UMass. I think that UMass has a bit more speed, especially through the neutral zone. So, that's one thing that I thought that St. Cloud did pretty well for a good chunk of the game, was that they would really get the neutral zone. It wasn't so much a trap as it was just making it difficult to get through and get zone entries. And one of the things that I thought UMass did well against Minnesota Duluth was, especially in that overtime, was getting pucks into the zone with possession. And if they can do that, they're going to be able to set things up. And so UMass, or St. Cloud rather, has to have good goaltending. I think that they can win the game in the neutral zone as well.
I also think that Brett Larson and company need to recognize that UMass is UMass. They're not Boston University. They're not Boston College, two Hockey East teams they've already faced. They did a great job of slowing down David Ferentz, which is really the speed of Boston University, and then the really talented Boston College team. But UMass comes in layers.
Yes.
And if you can slow down their forwards, that doesn't mean that, Delgaizo or Jones or Kessel is not right there behind them to then swoop into the play. And next thing you know, you still got a 2-on-1 down low with the defenseman and the forward. So that's, I think he's got to, their whole staff has to recognize that there's a little bit more to this Hockey East team than the two Hockey East teams they've already knocked off.
Touching on one of the things Chris said, I think it's important for them to be aggressive in managing the neutral zone and just not letting UMass come forward, repeatedly dumping it and letting them come forward. They've got to be aggressive in getting the puck deep and playing in there and not just, waiting around for chances. They've got to push it the other direction. And I think that's something that they have the players to do, but it's not necessarily always their style, it feels like. They feel like a team that maybe waits for chances sometimes.
Yeah, opportunistic.
And so I think they need to maybe it's counterproductive to try and say it that way to a team in going against the way you've done things this whole time, but they can't just let UMass come at them. They need to push it and go at them one-on-one in a lot of ways.
When we look at the Minutemen, maybe it's simplistic to say this, but they need to be the overtime UMass and not the first period UMass. What do we need to see out of Greg Carvel's squad on Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to have to be a team that dictates the pace. What we saw from Minnesota State against St. Cloud is that when they finally established their game, they were able to put the pressure on and limit chances against and really put the pressure on the goaltending. You get shots through, as Jim has mentioned before, it's about getting that offense in layers as well and making sure that Zach Jones and Matt Kessel and Mark Del Gaizo and Colin Felix and all those guys are engaged early in the game. Get them going, get pucks, work pucks low to high, and try to get some of those shots through, make that traffic happen in front of Rennick, and then you've got some opportunities. But I think that's one of the things that they really do well when they're at their best. And what we saw it in the overtime and kind of to mention, kind of off of what you said, Todd, was, if St. Cloud can be aggressive in the neutral zone and shut down plays, they're going to have more success. That's what UMD did successfully for a good chunk of that game. I was thinking Wyatt Kaiser shut down so many plays just by stepping up in the neutral zone and getting a body on somebody as soon as he has the puck. I mean, they were timing their hits. They were making sure that they were getting bodies on people. So if you can't get that established early, then all of a sudden you're playing a ground game almost where you're not really running gun and you have to, adjust. And this is, as all games are, going to be a game of adjustments. As we've seen, St. Cloud can make the adjustments, and so can UMass, and have a lot of success. So I think that the coaching matchup is going to be really fun in this one too.
I think two other things I'll add for UMass: discipline and staying out of the box. They were such a different team than they were in that 2019 semifinals that was filled with majors and guys taking runs. Greg Carl's been stressing it down the stretch, and they've been good at that. The other thing is, I think that they really have to figure out when they can forecheck. When they went down 2-1 last night, it was like they wanted to score within the next 5 minutes. They wanted to score the tying and go ahead goals on the same shot. And because of that, you ended up giving up a lot of odd man rushes. You were a little bit too aggressive. You got into the overtime when it was 2-2. Then you saw the two-man forecheck. Then you saw the pressure. You've got to know when you can go. And I think that is balancing stamina sometimes. And maybe you can't do that in the first period. You've got to play kind of more chess than checkers in this game. And I think that when you look at that, I think the big thing is knowing when to go.
If I'm Greg Carvel, I want to tell UMass that, look, this progression has got us here for a reason. We're here now because of what happened in 2019 and the way we built off of that and what we learned from that. And so you don't want to be overconfident getting what we believe is going to be three players back and a high score and you're starting goalie back. You don't want that to go to your head and say, hey, this is going to be good for us. You've got to keep the foot on the gas at that point and not just rest on having your leading scorer and your starting goalie back. But I think we saw this with Duluth a few years ago where they lost to Denver in that championship game. They came back the next year better because of it. They'd have been there. They learned what that was like. They used that as motivation. Now, it's a little different this year because they got that gap year last year where there wasn't a tournament.
Yeah.
So maybe the fire wasn't as strong. I mean, the players are different. The cast is, I don't even remember what the number of guys that are back that are from that team. But you've got to draw on that. You've got to build because Carvel's talked about it a lot that, look, we learned so much from that game that, we weren't ready to play a heavy team like Duluth in 2019. They were yesterday when they got to their game. Yep. And I think that means so much when you get into this experience where everyone's watching and what's at stake.
One guy who is back, who didn't get to play in that national championship game in 2019, is Bobby Trevino. Now he's a junior rather, and he's showing some leadership and showing some example. And we haven't really talked too much about him, but but he was just everywhere in that game last night.
He was, and he obviously had the assist on the game-winning goal. And, as Jim mentioned, heavy hockey isn't about, being physical. Bobby Trevino is not a big guy.
No.
But he absolutely worked the defenseman on that play. He found the space, and that's, being tough to play against when you have the puck is so much a part of that heavy game. And as you mentioned, now he has this chance at redemption. He's been their best player throughout the season. He's been one of my favorite players to watch just because of that work ethic, because of the heaviness, but then he has the skill in tight areas to make plays. I think, he is, as soon as when he's going, they are a much tougher team to play against. And I thought that was a big difference in that game. And I'm glad you brought him up, because I was just thinking, gosh, we haven't talked about him yet. And he's one of their best players and really should be one of the key figures in this game for UMass.
Yeah, I think that Greg Carvel has talked to me a number of times this year about freshman year, great year for Trevino, obviously. Misses that national title game because he was suspended, undisciplined hit. Sophomore year, really had the sophomore slump, laid back a little bit. And Greg Carvel said he just had to challenge him. He needed more time to, be physically fit. He needed more time, shooting pucks. He needed more time. These were all things in practices that he had to get to, and he did. And I think that he has become a very quiet leader on this team. Should have probably been in the Hobie Baker conversation. But the weird year this was, you didn't see enough games. He didn't, whatever the reason is, you're not getting the same exposure that Matt Boldy and some other players in Hockey East were. And he's left out. But he really is, a high-end player that, as much as we talk about some of these great role players, he might be the one elite player that's going to be in this game tomorrow night for UMass.
Doesn't it really match the team, though? I mean,
it does.
I mean, the whole progression thing I was just talking about is like 2 years ago, you got a guy that, was a little undisciplined, like the team was, I guess, maybe in some stretches there, and has really just, picked it up from there and moved it in a different direction and maybe takes it in a whole different direction to erase what happened 2 years ago for him personally.
National championship game Saturday night, 7 p.m. I should have asked before we started, but guys, do you want to go out on a limb or do you want to drop it there? Jimmy does. Jim wants to go out on a limb.
I always want predictions. Now,
okay, go for it.
I'm going to give you my prediction, 3-2. And I think it's going to be overtime. So whoever gets that lucky bounce in overtime, 3-2.
Well, you didn't go out on much of a limb at all there, did you?
Listen, it's a limb. I'm kind of heavy. I sit on limbs. They break.
Well, it would be terrific if it is that kind of a game. We had two absolutely fantastic games on Thursday night. There have been some years where the Frozen Four is 3 dud games, and I'm hoping for 3 terrific games. And I don't see any reason why we shouldn't see it unless there's a 5-minute major or some fluke thing that happens along the way.
I did think last night how good those games were. Maybe not because of it, but especially with the fact that there weren't delays for replays. There was no 5-minute delay to review a hit, to review goals. It just kept going and going. I mean, you had the TV timeout breaks and things like that. But it just felt like everything was building, didn't have to sit and wait for a while.
Those games had flow.
Yeah.
Like that was the great thing about it, is that there were layers to the game. There were different things that we were seeing, and they just went right through. And boy, that was nice. There were a couple there where I thought maybe we would get a review for various hits behind the play, or there was that one that was there was a close goal, almost goal, and I think it was in the first game, but
Ryan Sandelin had a shot that looked like it was on the line, or
normally you give him the benefit of the doubt in that situation based on what he's done in the last couple of weeks, but I think that that what we've gotten with this point with these two teams, we're going to get another game that's pretty flowy, and I think that benefits UMass a little bit more than it benefits St. Cloud. But I think that's going to be one of the key factors, is just who's kind of riding that wave and who can respond if they don't get off to that at the very beginning. And they've at least both experienced that now at this stage in this building, just yesterday as we record this. So, I mean, I think that they've got the right experience for giving us a really good championship game.
Well, with that, I think we'll wrap things there. It has been a terrific 2 games. We're expecting a great game tomorrow night, 7 p.m. ESPN. Thank you, Chris Peters, Todd Milewski, for joining us. For Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next season.
This has been the USCHO Spotlight, a production of U.S. College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.